Welcome boys and girls, Christine here with a discussion on the subject of Autoresolve in Total War Warhammer 3 Immortal Empires. This is something Creative Assembly has stated that they're working on in their blog post, but I want to go over the details of how Autoresolve, the way it's implemented at the moment, does ruin the game in more ways than one. First off is what Autoresolve actually values. You might think it's having heroes, it's having a high-ranking lord, but those things don't really matter all that much. Items may matter, especially items that increase your armor. So if we look at Grumbrindle over here and I were to acquire his armor over here, that would give me plus 8 armor. So that would matter. Other stats, not so much. But it's armor, it's leadership, and it's melee stats. For instance, in this situation, my Iron Drakes have 40 melee defense. That's the same melee defense as Dwarf Warriors, but Iron Drakes are also more heavily armored than Dwarf Warriors. You might think HP should matter, but surprisingly, it doesn't necessarily as much. Of course, all kinds of things do have an impact on Autoresolve, but armor, leadership, and melee stats, melee defense in particular, do matter a great deal. It creates a situation where some of the best armies for Autoresolve are armies of Iron Drakes if you're playing Dwarves. Or if you're playing Skaven, it's Warpfire Throwers, because a lot of Skaven units do have bad armor. Now, needless to say, an army made up purely of Warpfire Throwers or Iron Drakes is not really going to be a great army. But it is an army that will avoid having to fight a lot of battles in the first place. Especially the more annoying siege battles that you do have in the game. Second point is, what is Autoresolve meant to do and how does it fail in that purpose? There's all kinds of perspectives on this. There's people who will argue you should fight every single battle. That is not my view. I think what an Autoresolve system should do in these kind of games is reduce the tedium of a campaign. So you're not fighting every battle, but you're fighting the interesting battles, the ones that really matter. So in a campaign like this, a battle that would matter would be against Malekith, for instance. Because he is a legendary lord. If I eliminate his army right here, he's not really going to have a significant force to be able to oppose me if I march on Har Caldra. Even if I do ignore the Skaven with all the consequences that come from ignoring the Skaven over here, I could just wipe out Malekith at this point or lay siege to the Rakdo Gorge, then wipe him out on the next turn. But here's the ridiculous part of how Autoresolve works in the game with regards to that. One of the big problems is that a lot of these battles are not really worth fighting. Because many battles in a campaign will not be against a powerful opponent, will not be against an opponent that could actually give you a fight. Malekith could give me a fight over here. It says medium casualties. I'd probably actually take more casualties fighting this battle manually, but that's a reasonable enough result. It's actually one of the few cases where we do actually get a reasonable enough result. Right here. But the problem is, a lot of the time that you do have battles in a campaign, most of them are not going to be great battles. They're not going to be interesting. They're not going to challenge you. They're not going to teach you. If you're a new player, you're not going to learn the right lessons from playing these battles, or any real lessons whatsoever. And that's not what battles should do. And Autoresolve should not work from the perspective of allowing you to skip those kind of important battles that would actually teach you stuff. So you do have several issues in one, in that you can avoid them, the good battles, the battles that have meaningful gameplay, but you're then forced to fight the battles that don't have meaningful gameplay just because the Autoresolve situation doesn't fit the bill. And keep in mind, this is on legendary difficulty, very hard, all that kind of stuff. It is a ridiculous system, the way it does function. Even worse is between that army I just auto-resolved with Malekith and say the army over here in Nagrand, which of these armies do you think would be the bigger challenge on the battlefield? Yes, Nagrand has a substantial garrison, but I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that dealing with Malekith is the far harder battle, the more interesting battle, the meaningful gameplay type battle. The one in Nagrand, especially if I'm fighting a siege, is a pointless one. But between these two, the one you actually might be forced to fight would actually be Nagrand, and not Malekith, as I just showed. I just auto-resolved Malekith. If I just showed up to Nagrand, chances are I probably have to fight that. Or maybe not, because I'm dwarves with Iron Drakes. But I would probably take more casualties from the auto-resolve. If I fight the battle manually, I probably wouldn't. There's many things you can do in sieges. Just sieges inherently can allow you to significantly reduce casualties. By the way, funnily enough, I have Siege Attacker because of the miners. I mean, Scarbrand doesn't have Siege Attacker, but miners do. Ridiculous nonsense. Now, the reason I might face a worse auto-resolve result from Nagrand, as opposed to the one I had with Malekith, is because of the way settlements work with respect to auto-resolve. And it's kind of unique in Warhammer 3 as opposed to pretty much every single Total War game that I've played. Basically, every settlement, it can be a minor settlement and can be a major fortified capital. It doesn't matter what we're talking about, but every settlement has an auto-resolve modifier to it. Why is that? And why is it unique to Warhammer 3? Well, you can blame the tower defense minigame that Creative Assembly added into the game, because when they added that minigame, they also made it so that when you attack a settlement, minor settlement, because remember, all settlement battles were supposed to be unwalled settlements. They were still settlement battles, but unwalled, so you had buildable towers. Every settlement in the game has an auto-resolve benefit to it because of the towers you can build in it. It's a couple of towers that get counted to the auto-resolve. So every single settlement has a significant auto-resolve benefit. What this creates is the following situation, where the hardest and most interesting battles, the ones with the best gameplay, are the field battles, because that's where you have to worry about maneuvering. That's where the enemy enemy AI handles things better. Like, go up against Valkia in a field battle, she is a nightmare. Go up against Valkia in a siege, she is a joke. That is the reality of Warhammer 3. Simple as that. It doesn't matter if she has more units there. But because of that auto-resolve situation where settlements inherently get an auto-resolve benefit, and on top of that, settlements also have more units, so there's also an extra benefit on that. But just because they have that auto-resolve modifier baked into the settlements themselves, you have a situation where a player can build a lot of armies, that is almost every single faction in the game, that can auto-resolve their way for the entire campaign, for every single field battle in the campaign, but then ideally, you fight every siege manually. That is really, really crappy gameplay in a lot of different ways. And it's kind of unique to Warhammer 3. Now, I'm not talking about situations where there might be an actual army defending a settlement. I'm talking about situations where there's just a garrison. This is not how things worked in Warhammer 1 or Warhammer 2. It's not how things work in Troy. It's not how things work in Pharaoh. I would probably have to look back to Medieval 2 or Empire to think of a game that had that. And even then, just the auto-resolve in general in Medieval 2 and Empire were pretty bad. But you have a ridiculous turnaround in terms of auto-resolve of settlements versus auto-resolve of field battles. Again, field battles are the most interesting ones. We should have better battles. We should have better AI. We should have better scalability. We don't, and that is a problem. But what's worse, the battles you can skip more often than not for auto-resolve are those kind of interesting battles. And the battles you can't skip are the worst battles in the game, the siege battles. Warhammer 2 did not work like this. If you just showed up as element with a full army, on Legendary, I played Warhammer 2 just recently to showcase some things. You show up with an army, it can be a heavily fortified settlement, and there's only the garrison in a settlement, you can auto-resolve that. Instead, you're actually forced in that game to fight the field battles, whereas you can skip a lot of the sieges unless there is a defending army in a settlement, and then you're forced to fight it. And it depends on the kind of army, of course, depends on the kind of settlement. Like, the only settlement battle I had to fight in my Morathi campaign was actually Lothern, which had a massive garrison and an entire army defending it. So that was the only situation I had to fight the siege. Everything else, sieges, minor settlements, I could skip. They're not fun battles, they're not challenging battles, they don't teach you anything, but I had to fight the field battles. Those were interesting. Like, you might have to fight settlement battles in Warhammer 2, but it's more about reducing your casualties as opposed to you being forced because of the Autoresolve inherently. That's not how it works in Warhammer 3. So there's all kinds of issues with the way Autoresolve does work in the game, the things it cares about, the things it doesn't care about, the unit balancing, the racial balancing. That's also an issue. Skaven are really good on the battlefield, but they're really bad at Autoresolve unless you go with units that are specialist units, including Rattling Gunners, Jezzails, Warpfire Throwers. Yeah, you want those units. But unless you're playing Ikeclaw, and even then there's an argument, you don't just want to mass Warfire Throwers. I actually don't want to mass Warfire Throwers even in an Ikeclaw campaign. You would want a varied army. What I think Autoresolve could do better is push for better variety. What Pharaoh did very poorly is that it really punished you in Autoresolve for using chariots. I mean, it has the same armor issue, like heavily armored units doing better in Autoresolve, compared to, field battles. So that's an issue of Pharaoh inherently and Troy. So it is a problem. But one of the big problems of Pharaoh, Bronze Age period, chariots a big thing in history. You never wanted to use chariots because they would just take more damage. And so a lot of these meaningless battles, you would have to fight manually, or you could just not recruit chariots. It is an issue with like single entities. You can think of land ships, for instance, in Warhammer 3 having that problem, or just single entities in general taking more damage on that situation. We also have the further problem of the game, with respect to Autoresolve, really handling diverse armies poorly. For instance, if you're playing a campaign, in many cases, well, let's take the dwarves, right? How would you build a dwarven army? In many situations, you'd have a couple of melee units to protect your flanks, but the power of the dwarves comes from their flying units, artillery, range units, right? So mainly, you're going to have a lot more range units and artillery units than you're going to have melee units, especially since your heroes are melee. Except engineer, of course. Well, the problem is, when you have just a couple of melee units and mostly ranged or any kind of other units, including cavalry, those melee units are going to take a truckload of damage, which they would never do in a real battle. Because you're not just going to rush your dwarf warriors into an enemy line when you've got an entire artillery train. This pushes and incentivizes players to go for less army variety, for less interesting armies, for weaker armies, in fact. And that is a problem. It's also a problem that if you do only have... It is also a problem if you're playing a campaign and the only battles you have to fight, which is the problem of Pharaoh and Troy. In Pharaoh and Troy, you might only have to fight a couple of battles. But then that's not a great dynamic either. Yes, that is a problem. If you can just auto-resolve your way through the campaign for most of it and never have to fight the battle whatsoever, then that's not great campaign gameplay either. It gets really boring, very tedious. Yes, I'm saying it right here. Just being able to auto-resolve everything is not great. Now, I don't believe that you should be forced to fight the meaningless battles. I just think we should have more meaningful battles in a campaign. That does go back to the point of like how the AI behaves, how the game is designed, the end game, etc. The most interesting battles you do have in a campaign, the ones you're typically forced to fight, are the early game ones. And even then, not necessarily so much. Like, if you're playing someone like Arbol, you might have to fight 1-2 battles, and then you can probably just auto-resolve for the vast majority of it. But that also brings up another issue with demon units and all kinds of different units. Like, Bloodletters can hold their own very well and win against Chaos Warriors, but if you're playing any Khorne campaign, for instance, getting Bloodletters is a waste of resources. That's not how it should work. Better variety, instead of single unit builds or single unit type builds, push players towards diversity. I would like actual strength of units to be represented well in the Autoresolve situation. What people have talked about is maybe the Autoresolve should be dependent on unit tiers, which it isn't right now. It's based on stats, armor in particular. Tiers don't matter. Maybe it should be based on unit cost, the baseline cost. The one statistic, funnily enough, the one statistic that Creative Assembly keeps messing around with respect to units is how much they cost. That's for multiplayer purposes. So you already have people within Creative Assembly spending a lot of time and effort rebalancing these units in terms of their cost. Well, maybe you could use that cost as a reasonable perspective for how their Autoresolve could be, among other things, unit tiers. I also believe that one of the most important things in Autoresolve that should be counted is Lord ranks. Like, how, and experience in general. How experienced is your army? How experienced is the enemy army? How experienced are your heroes? Items, as I said, they do count for something, but they should count maybe a bit more. Because a hero with a bunch of items is going to be a lot more powerful than a naked one. Those kind of things should factor in far more heavily. Because let me put it like this. You can have an army of tier 1 Bretonnian peasants, but it still would be it would still feel like a doom stack if they're led by a high-end Lewin Leon Kerr with the Sword of Cain. He would solo a lot of different armies. And that's something that should be reflected in the Autoresolve. Not the way it's working right now, where you might just be able to Autoresolve that if you just bring an entire army under some nameless schmuck that just has a bunch of Chaos Warriors or Dwarf Warriors. That is a really bad system. Also, on the subject, speaking about units, one of the stupid things about the Autoresolve, about how it counts things, is shields. Yes, shields. Like, I could understand it in situations where the enemy has a lot of range in it, to a degree, because no one's just gonna get there, like, no one's just gonna recruit a bunch of Dwarf Warriors with gray weapons and throw them against a bunch of Wood Elves, or I assume most people wouldn't. But shielded units, from my experience, tend to do a lot better in Autoresolve than unshielded units, which is one of the reasons recruiting a bunch of unshielded units, especially if you're only recruiting a couple of melee units, is genuinely harmful for your campaign. That's my point. We do need better battles. We need a better Autoresolve system. We need a system that is reducing the grind, not adding to it, which it is at the moment. We need a system that encourages people to get better at the game, playing the battles, playing the interesting battles. We do need more of those battles, as I've stated. And we need a proper representation of actual strength. Now, I think it's fine if you do have a situation where if a player has built a proper army, leveled up their lords, they can just steamroll the map. If they don't encounter any worthwhile opposition. We should, so there's more to it. Like, again, there's a lot of different things, but in terms of Autoresolve itself, there's no genuine opposition. You shouldn't be forced to fight a bunch of battles. Now, I do believe it's important to have good battles in the campaign, because just dealing with the campaign situation and no battles whatsoever does get boring very quickly. But that's my perspective. Let me know what you guys think. Costin signing out.